The PI slid an envelope across the table. I opened it expecting proof. What I found instead was a mirror. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what was in that envelope, you have to understand the 6 months that came before it. You have to understand the version of me that walked into that diner with absolute certainty that my wife was betraying me, because that certainty felt so clean, so logical, so completely unassailable. And the thing about certainty is that it doesn't announce itself as a problem. It announces itself as a gift. My name doesn't matter right now. What matters is that I am someone who has spent his entire adult life believing in systems. Cause and effect, input and output. If you collect enough data, you can explain anything. I run operations for a mid-sized auto parts manufacturer outside Toledo. We make precision components for brake assemblies, mostly for the domestic market. My job is to look at a production line and see inefficiencies before they become failures. I am, by every professional measure, very good at this. I notice things. Small deviations from baseline. Patterns that don't fit the model. I catch problems early. I thought I was doing the same thing with my marriage. Dana and I had been together for 15 years, married for 12. She's a pediatric oncology nurse at Toledo Children's, which I always told people with a kind of borrowed pride, the way you do when someone you love does something genuinely hard and genuinely good. People would react the way people always react. They'd say, "Oh, I could never do that." And Dana would smile and say, "You'd be surprised what you can do." She meant it. She was never performatively noble about the work. She just did it. And we had a good marriage. I want to be careful about that, because it would be easy, in retrospect, to rewrite the early years as secretly troubled, as quietly building toward disaster. That's not true. We were good. We laughed at the same things. We took road trips. We argued about small, manageable things, whose turn it was to call the plumber, whether to retile the kitchen ourselves or hire someone. We had the kind of marriage where the fights were small enough that you could resolve them before you went to sleep and mean it. The change started gradually enough that I didn't recognize it as a change. That's always how it works, I think. Nothing announces itself. It was October, and Dana had been on a long stretch of difficult shifts. That happens in oncology. Patients who've been fighting for months reach a kind of pivot point, and suddenly a whole cluster of cases becomes critical at the same time. I understood that. I didn't track the beginning of the change to any specific date, because I wasn't tracking anything yet. I was just living my life. We both were. But by November, I noticed she was coming home later. Not dramatically later. Not 3 in the morning. Nothing like that. 40 minutes. An hour. Sometimes she'd text and say she was finishing paperwork, and I wouldn't think twice. Then it started being 90 minutes, and the texts stopped coming. I'd send one. I'd get back. On my way. No explanation. No detail. I told myself it was the job. Told myself oncology was brutal and she was tired and she needed decompression time, and I should give her that. And I did. I gave her that for a long time. By December, the intimacy was gone. And I don't just mean physical intimacy, though that too. I mean the basic connective tissue of a marriage. She stopped telling me stories about her day. She used to do that. Used to come home and narrate things. Not the clinical things, but the human things. A kid who'd demanded SpongeBob socks at his IV appointment. A parent who'd brought a whole extended family to a scan result, and they'd eaten tamales in the waiting room. She told stories like a person who processed the world through language, who needed to speak things into existence to make them real. And then she stopped. We'd sit at dinner and I'd ask about her day, and she'd say, "Fine, tired," and go back to her food. I would reach for her hand sometimes at night, and she'd squeeze it and then let go. Not pull away, just let go. returned to her side of the bed like she'd been somewhere briefly and needed to come back. I told myself she was exhausted. I told myself she'd come back to me when the hard stretch passed, but the hard stretch didn't pass, and I kept noticing things I wasn't looking for. The Christmas cards we wrote every year. She'd done them alone in previous years and brought me the stack to sign, but this year she didn't do them at all. I mentioned it once, gently, and she looked up at me and said, "I just couldn't this year." And there was something in her voice that I catalogued as evasion and now understand was pure depletion. She simply did not have the reserves for Christmas cards. She had nothing left for ordinary life, and I interpreted that as evidence that her energy was going somewhere else. I did something small in January that I'm not proud of either. We had a shared calendar, work schedules, appointments, the basics. I'd always had access to it. We'd set it up years ago. I started checking it more carefully than I used to. Looking for calendar entries I didn't recognize. There were none. There was nothing there. Just her work schedule and a dentist appointment in February and a blank where her personal life used to be penciled in. All those blank days. I told myself blank was suspicious. I told myself a woman with nothing to hide would fill a calendar the way she used to. She used to write things in our shared calendar, book clubs she was trying out, dinners with her hospital friends, the occasional yoga class. The calendar had been quiet for months. I kept that observation in my mental file. Blank calendar, like a woman who'd stopped planning ahead, or a woman who was keeping a second calendar I didn't have access to. I know how that sounds now. I knew, even then, that it was a reach. But when you're building a case, a reach feels like thoroughness. January. She started coming home and going straight to the shower. Every night. I noticed that. I noticed because it was new. It used to be every other day, and now it was every single night, and sometimes she'd be in there for 30 minutes. I could hear the water running. I started associating the sound of the shower with the feeling that something was wrong. Her phone had always been a shared kind of thing, not that we monitored each other, just that we left our phones on the kitchen counter at night, and if either of us got a call at 2 in the morning, we'd hand it to the other one. That stopped too. Her phone started going on the nightstand on her side of the bed, face down, on silent. Every night. Not vibrate, silent. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand. These were not paranoid inventions. These were real changes, real data points. And I am not the kind of person who invents data. I am the kind of person who looks at data very carefully and then draws the most logical conclusion. The most logical conclusion, I thought, was obvious. I'm not proud of it, but I want you to understand how the mind works when it starts building a case. Every new piece of information became a brick. She stopped wearing her wedding ring when she slept. She said it was because she'd started turning her hand in her sleep and waking herself up, but she'd worn it for 12 years without that problem. She started wearing light perfume on work days when she'd never bothered before. Small things. Individually, nothing. But I wasn't looking at them individually. February is when I made my first real move. I'm not going to dress it up as something more innocent than it was. I waited until Dana was in the shower one evening, and I picked up her phone. It was locked with a Face ID, and she'd always had a passcode backup, a 6-digit code I didn't know. But before the Face ID was required, there was a preview of the most recent text in the notification bar. Just a line. It said, "See you Thursday. I'll have the handouts ready." That was it. That was the whole thing. And I stood there in the kitchen with the sound of the shower running, and I thought, handouts? What kind of handouts? What happened on Thursday? I put the phone back. I stood at the counter. I told myself I was being irrational. I made a cup of tea. I went to bed, but I didn't sleep. I kept my schedule obsessively at work. I am the kind of person who runs very specific calendar systems, project management software, time block scheduling. So it wasn't strange when I started applying the same approach at home. I began noting times. Dana leaves for work, 6:47 a.m. Dana's shift ends, 7 p.m. Dana arrives home, 8:33 p.m. That's an hour and 33 minutes unaccounted for. Her commute is 22 minutes. I'd timed it myself. Over 3 weeks, I kept that log and a note on my phone. Just times, no commentary. The gap ranged from 40 minutes to 2 hours and 18 minutes. She never mentioned where she was. I never asked. I didn't ask because I was afraid of the answer. I want to be honest about that. I kept collecting data because collecting data felt like control, and asking the direct question felt like the moment I'd lose control forever. March. That's when I made the decision that I won't pretend I'm entirely comfortable with, even now, even given everything I know. I looked up Ohio law, specifically because I wanted to be thorough. In Ohio, a spouse can legally place a GPS tracking device on a jointly titled vehicle. Our Subaru was titled in both names. I'd bought the device the week before. A small magnetic unit, the kind that's about the size of a deck of cards. I put it under the left rear wheel well on a Saturday morning when Dana was at the grocery store. She was gone for 45 minutes. I had it installed in 6. I'm not telling you this because I think it was right. I'm telling you because I thought, at the time, that I was being careful, that I was being methodical, that I was protecting myself. The tracking data from the first week confirmed almost everything I'd already logged. Hospital to home. A stop at the CVS on Tuesday. Home. Normal. But there were 2 instances, on a Wednesday and a Friday, where the car sat in the hospital parking lot for 93 minutes and 2 hours and 7 minutes after her shift ended. Just sat there, not moving, not going anywhere, just parked. I zoomed in on the map. I looked at the coordinates. It was the main hospital lot. Not a side street, not a hotel, not somebody's apartment. Just the hospital parking lot where she worked. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself she was finishing late paperwork in her car. But the question wouldn't leave me alone. Why the car? If you're doing paperwork, why not stay inside? By April, I was not sleeping well. I was running 2 jobs, my actual one and the one I'd invented for myself. I'd become my own intelligence department. I knew her movements with the kind of precision that should have been alarming to me. The fact that it wasn't alarming, the fact that it felt like competence. I understand now what that says about me. I didn't understand it then. I hired the PI in the 2nd week of April. I want to be clear about the sequence, because the sequence matters. I didn't hire him impulsively. I hired him after 3 months of obsessive data collection had failed to give me a definitive answer. He came recommended through a guy I knew from a professional contact. I'd heard his name mentioned in passing in a context I don't need to explain, and he had a flat rate for a 2-week investigation. I told him I needed documentation. Times, locations, photographs were legally obtained. I told him I needed thoroughness. He was a quiet man, mid-50s. The kind of person who seems like they've absorbed a great deal of human disappointment without becoming cruel about it. He asked me what I was hoping to find. I told him I was hoping to find nothing. He said most people say that. The 2 weeks were the strangest of my life. I went to work. I came home. I had dinner with my wife. She sat across from me and I watched her and tried to see what I'd missed, tried to see if there was something in her face I could read. There wasn't. She was, and this is the word that kept occurring to me, absent. Not physically absent, just somehow not there. She'd answer questions, she'd respond, she'd occasionally smile at something on TV. but it was like the lights were on in a house where nobody was home. On the Thursday of the second week, I was running a quality control audit at the plant, and I got a text from the PI that said, "Finishing up tomorrow. Can we meet Saturday?" I typed back, "Yes." Then I went back to looking at defect rates in a batch of caliper brackets because what else was I going to do? I want to tell you about one moment from that period that I keep coming back to. It was a Wednesday night, middle of the second week, and I came downstairs at around 11 because I couldn't sleep. Dana was sitting in the kitchen in the dark, not doing anything, not on her phone, just sitting at the table with her hands folded in front of her, looking at the window. There was a street light outside that cast a line of yellow across the linoleum floor. I stood in the doorway. She didn't hear me. I watched her for a moment, and there was something on her face that I couldn't name. Not happiness, not guilt, not anything I had a category for. It looked like a person who was very far away and very tired from the distance. I almost said her name. I almost walked in and sat down next to her and said, "Hey, what's going on with you? Something's wrong. Tell me." I didn't. I went back upstairs. I tell you that because I need you to understand. The information I was missing was never hidden. It was sitting in the kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, in the dark, waiting. The PY's name was Frank Castellano. We met at a diner off Monroe Street on a Saturday morning. It was raining. I ordered coffee and didn't drink it. He ordered coffee and did. He slid an envelope across the table. I looked at it for a moment. I had this very particular feeling. Not excitement. More like the feeling you get when you're at the top of a roller coaster, that still half second before the drop when your body doesn't know yet what's coming, but knows something is. I was certain, genuinely certain. I had assembled too much circumstantial architecture for the conclusion to be wrong. I opened the envelope. There were 12 photographs. I went through them slowly. The first 3 were Dana walking from the hospital to her car, alone, looking at her phone. The 4th was her car in the parking lot, time-stamped, 7:48 p.m. The 5th was from a wider angle, still the parking lot, still just her car, 8:31 p.m. The 6th was Dana walking into a building, low, brick. The sign above the door said, Sacred Heart Parish Center. It was a Thursday night, 6:15 p.m. The 7th was the interior of what appeared to be a meeting room, taken through a window from outside, showing a circle of chairs, about 8 or 9 people, some kind of facilitated group gathering. Dana's back was visible in one of the chairs. The 8th was Dana coming out of a building on Secor Road. Frank had written on a post-it note attached to the back, Dr. Miriam Cho, licensed clinical social worker. Session approximately 50 minutes. Every Tuesday, 5 p.m. The 9th through 12th were her car again, in the hospital parking lot on different nights. Alone. Just sitting there. I went through all 12 photographs. I went back to the beginning and went through them again. I set them down on the table. I looked at Frank. He was watching me with the careful neutrality of a man who has delivered this kind of result before. "That's everything?" I said. "That's everything," he said. "You covered the full 2 weeks. Full 2 weeks, including 3 Thursdays for the church group. I ran the plates of every car in the lot on those nights. I cross-checked the group against parish records. It's a registered grief support group, licensed facilitator. It's been running for 2 years. He paused. "Your wife is not meeting anyone." I sat with that for a moment. And I want to tell you what happened in my head, because this is the part where I don't come out looking good, and I think it's the most important part. My first thought was not relief. My first thought was, he missed something. I'm telling you that as plainly as I can because I need you to understand what kind of man I was in that moment. My wife was going to therapy. She was attending a grief support group at a church. She was sitting alone in a parking lot at night. Alone. Not with someone. Not texting anyone. Not meeting anyone. I had paid a professional investigator to spend 2 weeks documenting every movement she made, and the result was, she is in pain, and she is dealing with it alone. And my first instinct was to wonder if the investigator had missed something. "What about the Thursday when your associate covered?" I said. Frank looked at me steadily. "He's been working these cases for 9 years. He knows what he's doing." "The grief group, you confirm the facilitator is licensed?" "Master's degree in counseling psychology. Been running the group since 2022. He tapped the envelope. "The social worker's office is a regular professional suite. I checked the building directory. There's no reason to believe it's anything other than what it is." I picked up the photographs again. I studied the one of Dana's car in the parking lot. The timestamp said 8:17 p.m. I thought about the GPS logs, the nights the car had sat there for 2 hours. I looked at the photo and thought, she's waiting to meet someone. He just didn't get there in time. Frank was still watching me. He said, "Mr. Pressler, I've done this work for a long time. I know what an affair investigation looks like when something is there. This isn't that." He paused and he said the next thing with a quietness that I've thought about many times since. "I don't know what your wife is dealing with, but she's not dealing with another man." I drove home. I didn't think about Dana, not about what she might be going through, not about what the words grief support group meant, not about what it said that she needed a licensed social worker every Tuesday at 5 o'clock. I thought about the gaps in the data. I thought about what Frank might have missed. I cataloged the variables he couldn't have monitored: her work email, her office interactions, the one Thursday he'd taken a sick day and sent an associate. I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes, going over it in my head. Like a man rechecking a spreadsheet that keeps giving him the wrong answer, convinced the data must be wrong rather than the formula. It took me until Sunday to even begin to absorb what I'd actually been told. I want to try to explain the process because I think it's important. When you've been building a case, when you've spent months in the mindset of a man who knows something is wrong and is trying to prove what, the mind becomes like a canal. Information can only flow in one direction. And information that doesn't fit the channel doesn't feel like new information. It feels like a problem with the source. Sunday morning, Dana got up early for a shift. I watched her make coffee. I watched her put on her scrubs. I watched her check her phone and slide it into her pocket. She moved through the kitchen with the particular efficiency of someone who doesn't have much energy to waste. I said, "You look tired." She looked at me for a second, and there was something in her eyes. Not guardedness, not guilt. Something closer to surprise. Like she hadn't expected me to notice. Like she'd stopped expecting me to notice. "I'm okay," she said, and left. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after I heard the car back out of the driveway. I thought about the photograph of her sitting in that parking lot at night. I thought about what kind of tired keeps a person sitting in a cold car for 2 hours before they can go inside. I started to think about the grief support group. I started to wonder, for the first time, genuinely for the first time, not what she was hiding, but what she was carrying. And I did what I do when I want to understand something. I researched. I am not going to walk you through every page I read, but I want to give you the shape of it. Secondary traumatic stress, sometimes called compassion fatigue, is a real and recognized condition in healthcare workers. It's not weakness. It's not burnout exactly, though it looks similar from the outside. It's what happens when you absorb the emotional weight of others' suffering over a long period of time, and the normal mechanisms for processing it stop working. Nurses in pediatric oncology are at particularly high risk. The literature is extensive. The symptoms are almost textbook: withdrawal, disrupted sleep, difficulty experiencing positive emotions, detachment from people you love. I read about how depression presents differently in people whose professional identity is built around caring for others. How the same person who can be steady and competent with a patient in crisis can come completely apart in private. How the need to be strong at work produces a kind of emotional debt that compounds quietly, invisibly, until one day it doesn't. How people who love hard workers the way I love Dana can miss it for months because the person keeps showing up for their job, and so you assume they're fine. I printed some of it out. I actually printed it out. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I needed it to be physical, on paper, something I could hold. Maybe I thought that if I made it a document, I could approach it the way I approached everything, systematically with a plan. I put it in the kitchen drawer. I sat down at the table. I thought about what I knew. Dana had been leaving work and driving home, but she'd been stopping in the parking lot for up to 2 hours before coming inside. She hadn't told me about it. She'd been going to therapy every Tuesday and hadn't mentioned it. She was attending a grief support group at a church she'd never brought up. She'd stopped telling me stories. She'd stopped sleeping well. She'd stopped touching me. None of this, not a single part of it, had anything to do with another man. I'd spent 4 months building a case against my wife for something she hadn't done, while she spent 4 months going to therapy alone and sitting in parking lots alone and crying in showers alone and finding ways to cope with something she hadn't told me about, had not been able to tell me about, or hadn't felt able to, or some combination that I was beginning to understand had something to do with me. The confrontation, I don't love calling it that, but that's what it was, happened on a Tuesday. She didn't know I knew about the therapy. I'd spent a week deciding how to do this, which is its own kind of telling. I approached the conversation the same way I'd approach a difficult meeting at work. I prepared. I had a mental outline. I had what I thought of, God help me, as deliverables. She got home around 8. She'd showered at the hospital, I could tell. She came in and set her bag down and asked if I'd eaten, and I said yes, and she said she wasn't hungry, and poured herself a glass of water and stood at the counter. I said, "Can we talk?" She set the glass down. She turned and looked at me, and I recognized the quality of her attention. It was the careful kind, the kind that means a person is bracing. We sat at the kitchen table, and I did the thing I'd been rehearsing. I laid it out. Not cruelly. I want to be clear about that. I was not trying to be cruel. But I laid it out. The times, the gaps, the late arrivals, the silence, the phone, the fact that things between us had changed so completely and so suddenly, and I needed to understand what was happening. I said, "I've noticed a pattern that I can't explain, and I need you to help me understand it." She listened. She didn't interrupt. She had her hands folded on the table in front of her, and she looked at them while I talked, and I kept going, kept laying it out the way I would present evidence in a production review, methodical, thorough. And then I made the mistake that tells you everything about the kind of husband I had been. I told her about the GPS tracker. I told her I'd installed it on the Subaru. I told her it was legal, that jointly titled vehicles in Ohio. And I said jointly titled, like I was presenting terms and conditions. I told her what the data showed, the gaps, the parking lot. I told her I'd needed to understand the pattern. Her face did something I can't fully describe. It went very still in the way of a person who has just been handed something painful and is deciding in real time how to hold it. She said, You put a tracker on my car. I said again that it was legal. She said, I didn't ask you if it was legal. The kitchen was very quiet. She said, and then what? You hired someone. I said, yes. She didn't raise her voice. That was the thing I hadn't prepared for. I'd expected anger, defensiveness, some reaction I could meet with my prepared points, my documented evidence. Instead, she sat there in the quiet and looked at me like a woman reading a letter she'd been bracing to receive for a long time. She said, I knew something was off. I thought you were pulling away from me. I thought. She stopped. I thought maybe you were done with me, with us. And I didn't push it because I didn't have the energy to push it. She shook her head. You were investigating me. I thought you'd stopped caring. That undid something in me. The entire architecture of my certainty, months of data, timestamps, photographs, the rational case I'd built so carefully. It couldn't survive the information that while I'd been surveilling her, she'd been wondering if I'd stopped loving her. I said her name. She held up one hand. Not dramatically, just a small, patient gesture. She said, I need you to listen to me now. I'm not angry. I need you to hear this. And she told me. His name was Marcus. He was 7 years old. He had acute lymphoblastic leukemia, which is one of the more treatable forms of childhood cancer, and there was every reason to believe he was going to be okay. That's what made it so hard, she said, because he was doing the right things and his numbers were trending the right direction, and he liked to draw superheroes with oversized hands, and he called her Nurse D because her full name gave him trouble, and he had this thing where he'd tell her a knock-knock joke every time she came in. The same ones, always the same ones, but he'd laugh every time, like it was the first time he'd thought of it. He died on September 12th. Sudden septic infection, secondary to a treatment protocol that had been working. She was on shift. She was there. She said, I've been a nurse for 14 years. I've lost patience. I know how to lose patience, but I couldn't find the place to put this one. She paused. She was very still. I started going to therapy in October. I didn't tell you because I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't want to make you carry it too. I thought if I could just process it enough, I could come back to you whole. I thought that was the right thing to do. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. There's a grief support group at Sacred Heart on Thursday nights. It's mostly healthcare workers. I started going in November. She looked at me. And sometimes, after a shift, I sit in the parking lot. I can't bring the hospital home with me. I can't walk in here right after and be a wife. I need some time to be nobody, to just sit and breathe and let it separate. She stopped. That's what I've been doing. The silence in the kitchen was a different kind of silence now. It had weight in it. I thought about the photographs. The car in the lot, time-stamped, hour after hour. I'd looked at that image and thought, who is she waiting for? And the answer was, no one. She was waiting for herself to be ready to come home. She was waiting for the grief to compress enough to fit through the front door without filling every room. I said her name. I think I said it the way you say a thing when you've been wrong about it for a long time and you're finally saying the right version. She said, I needed you to notice something was wrong with me. Not with us. Her voice wasn't hard. It was honest in the way things are honest when a person has given up trying to manage your reaction. Every time you asked if I was okay and I said fine, I wanted you to not believe me. I wanted you to push. I wanted you to sit down next to me and say you weren't buying it. She shook her head. But you collected data instead. I keep turning that sentence over. I've turned it over 1,000 times since. You collected data instead. I want to try to explain. Not excuse, explain what happened in my head over the last 4 months, because I think it matters, and I think if I can say it accurately, it might mean something. I love Dana. I loved her all through this. Every piece of data I collected, every timestamp I logged, every photograph I studied, I was doing all of it because the thought of losing her was unbearable. That's real. That was never not true. But somewhere in the gap between loving her and being present for her, I'd built a very elaborate system, and the system ran on a single assumption. If something is wrong, it must be a problem to solve. Problems have sources. If you find the source, you fix it. If she was distant, if she was unhappy, if she was leaving something out, something external had to be causing it. Someone. Something. A variable I could identify and address. The possibility that she was simply in pain. That she was carrying something heavy and private and had built a small, quiet infrastructure around the carrying of it. That wasn't a variable I'd modeled, because pain doesn't have a fix. You can't collect enough data to resolve grief. You can't install a tracker to locate where someone's sorrow comes from and then remove it. You just have to sit next to the person while they carry it. I hadn't sat next to her. Not once, not really. I'd been in the same house, I'd been at the same table, but I hadn't sat next to her. I'd been in a separate room in my own head, building my case, logging my times, and she'd been in parking lots alone. I asked her, and I didn't ask well, I fumbled it, but I said, "Why didn't you tell me about Marcus, about any of it?" She thought about that for a moment. She was honest about it, which is one of the things I've always loved about her. She doesn't give you the easy answer just to give you an answer. She said, "I think I didn't trust that you'd be able to sit with it. I think I was afraid that if I told you, you'd try to fix it. You'd find a resource or a specialist or a grief counselor and a 15-step plan, and it would all be very thorough and none of it would be what I needed." She paused. "What I needed was for you to just be sad with me. That's all. Just be sad with me for a while." I thought about every instinct I'd had over the last 4 months. Research, systems, documentation, cause, effect, solution. She'd needed me to sit next to her in the dark, and I'd gone upstairs. The kitchen was quiet for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car went by. I said, "I'm sorry about Marcus." She looked at me. Something shifted slightly in her face. "He used to tell me the same knock-knock joke," she said. "Every visit, knock-knock. 'Who's there? Let us who? Let us in. It's cold out here.'" She smiled, and it was the most heartbreaking smile I've ever seen. The kind that knows exactly what it's smiling at and knows it can't get there. Every time, he'd crack up, like he just thought of it. I didn't say anything. For once in my life, I didn't try to say anything. She sat with it for a moment. Then she said quietly, "He liked extra blankets. The hospital ones were too thin. I used to bring him one from home." She paused. "I still have it. I'm not going to tell you I cried, because I don't think that's the point. I think the point is that I finally stopped looking for something to solve and just listened to my wife tell me about a 7-year-old boy who told the same joke every visit and laughed every time. I just listened. I didn't log it. I didn't analyze it. I sat there and I let it be what it was. We sat there for a long time. At some point she said, "I think we need help, both of us. I'm already getting help, but I think we need help together." I said, "I know." She said, "I need you to understand something, Joel." And my name in her mouth at that point carried so much history. 12 years of a name being said by the same voice in 1,000 different tones, and this tone was the most careful one, the most considered. I need to know that you see me as a person, not a problem to solve, not a variable, not something that's been behaving inconsistently and needs to be diagnosed. She looked at me directly. A person, with things going on inside me that you don't always have access to. Can you be with someone like that? It's a hard question. I want to tell you it was an easy question, but it wasn't, because what she was describing, being with someone whose interior life you can't fully track, can't fully monitor, can't fully understand and predict, that's genuinely frightening to someone built the way I am. Not because I don't trust her, because I don't trust the not knowing. I've spent my whole life constructing systems specifically designed to eliminate not knowing. I've built a career on it. My job at the plant exists because someone has to be the person who catches the thing everyone else missed, who finds the deviation before it becomes a failure. I am, professionally, the person who never lets anything slip by unexamined. Being in a marriage is not like running a production line. I understand that now in a way I didn't before. The variables in a marriage are not production defects. The person across from you at the kitchen table is not a system to be optimized. And when she goes quiet, when she retreats, when she sits in a parking lot in the cold for 2 hours, that is not a deviation from baseline that requires investigation. That is a person who is suffering. That is a person who needs something from you. And if you've made her feel, over years of living together, that you are better at managing her than knowing her, she will carry her suffering somewhere you can't follow. I said, I want to try. She said, trying isn't enough this time. I need to know you actually want that. Not as a project, not as a version of me you're restoring to some prior state. I need you to want me as I actually am right now, broken and grieving and not always available. Can you actually want that? I didn't have a clean answer. I think she knew I didn't. She didn't seem to need one exactly. She seemed to need me to sit with the question without immediately packaging it into a deliverable. So I did. I sat with it. I don't know how long we sat there. The clock on the stove read 11:43 when I next thought to look. Eventually, she said she was going to go to bed. She stood up and put her glass in the sink. She paused at the doorway and said, without turning around, I'll call Dr. Chen's office tomorrow. The couples therapist my individual therapist recommended. I've had the number for 2 months. A pause. I kept thinking you'd ask me what was wrong and I could tell you, and then we'd go together, but you didn't ask. She went upstairs. I heard the water run briefly. I heard her get into bed. I sat at the kitchen table until well past midnight, in the dark, the streetlight putting its yellow stripe across the linoleum floor. I thought about the night I'd stood in the doorway and seen her sitting here the same way. How close I'd been. How easily I could have just walked in and sat down. I thought about all the data I'd collected. 47 pages of GPS logs if you stacked the screenshots. 12 photographs. A 2-week PI report. A note in my phone with over 100 timestamps. What I had assembled, with extraordinary precision, was a portrait of a woman in terrible pain who was trying to protect the people she loved from that pain, and who was doing it alone because she'd read me well enough to know I'd turn it into a project. She had read me correctly. The appointment at Dr. Chen's office was on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks later. 3rd floor of a building on Bancroft, which I know because I parked and walked up and noted it, because that's what I do. The waiting room had the specific inoffensive decor of a space carefully designed not to ask anything of you. Muted colors, a small water feature, magazines that were 3 months old. Dana was already there when I arrived. She'd come from an early shift. She was in her coat still, her scrubs underneath, and she had a paper cup of coffee from the cart in the lobby. She looked tired. She'd looked tired for months. I understood now what kind of tired it was. I sat down. She didn't move to close the gap between us, and I didn't either. There was one chair between us, empty. She looked at her coffee. I looked at the water feature, a small column of water running over flat stones. We sat like that for a few minutes. I thought about what I would say to her, if I could say anything. I had no outline for it. I had no organized presentation. I had just the two of us sitting in a row of chairs, one seat apart, and the sound of the water, and the completely open and terrifying and necessary question of what comes next. I didn't know if the marriage would survive. I want to be honest with you about that the way Dana was honest with me. Without packaging it, without smoothing it into something more manageable. I had damaged something real, not by watching, not by tracking. Those were symptoms of the damage that was already there. The years of treating Dana like a system I was responsible for managing rather than a person I was responsible for knowing. The PI, the GPS, the phone checks. Those were just the logical endpoint of a very long pattern I'd never named as a pattern because it had never produced a crisis before. It was producing one now. I had hurt my wife, not by following her, or not only by following her. I had hurt her by being the kind of husband who, when his wife sat at a kitchen table in the dark at 11 at night, went back to bed. She'd built a whole private life around her grief because she'd learned over years of living with me that there were kinds of softness I couldn't hold. She hadn't taught me that because she was protecting me. She'd taught me that because I'd shown her it was true. The door to Dr. Chen's office opened. A middle-aged woman with a patient face stood in the doorway. Dana stood up. I stood up. We walked toward the door. Not together, not hand in hand, not the way two people walk in a movie about reconciliation. Just two people walking toward the same door at the same time, close enough to be almost side by side. I don't know what happens in that room. I mean that in the literal sense. I'm telling you this from the waiting room, from the moment before we went in, because that's where the story really is. Not in the resolution, not in the clean ending or the fractured ending or any particular ending at all. It's here, in the space between two chairs, in the silence between two people who love each other and have to figure out if love is enough or if love requires something more than they've been giving it. Dana had said, "I need you to see me as a person, not a problem to solve." I keep returning to that. Not because I've solved it, I haven't, but because it's the truest thing anyone has ever said to me about myself. I spend my working life optimizing systems. I spend it reading deviations from baseline and tracing causes and implementing corrections. I am, in the language of the work, very good at closing gaps. She was not a gap. She is not a gap. She is a person who carried a dead child with her for months and didn't know how to put him down and who needed someone to sit next to her while she figured out how. I was not that person. I want to be. The P. I had slid that envelope across the table, and I'd opened it expecting proof of something I feared. What was in it was proof of something I'd failed to see. Not because the evidence was hidden, not because she was hiding it, but because I'd been so certain I knew what I was looking for that I never looked up to see what was actually there. I don't know what the next step is. Donna doesn't know either. We're in a room we've never been in before, and there's no data for it, and I can't track it, and I can't know in advance how it comes out. I am trying to learn to be in a room I can't map. That's where we are.